Awesome, Mark.
The next class this evening, we're going to have 4 people, panellists. We're going to discuss creationism. Now, I brought along a couple of books with me tonight. These books, these 2 books, are fundamental to the society we live in today. That is, the language we use, the forms of expression we use, a whole lot of principles have got come out of these 2 books. They were both written at or about the same time. In fact, one of them, the time that it took to write one book, included the time that the other one was done. They are both anthologies in that they're collections of other stories, shorter articles, books and so forth. One's the Bible. That's the King James Version, the authorised version of the Bible, which is, as anybody knows, the only real one. And the other one is the works of William Shakespeare. Now, these were written at the same time. So Hamlet came out, I think, in 1611, in the same Bible. Both of these books contain, as I said, a lot of stories. They both contain stories which purport to be history. What would you think if you found that they were teaching the historical stories about the kings of England in universities and schools based on the plays of Shakespeare? It would not be acceptable. Nobody would accept it. You'd say, well, that's just nonsense. Shakespeare was writing historical plays. Yes, there were real people in them, there were real events exhibited, but the plays were there to give a message, tell a story, make points about how people behave and how people react and work with each other. There is, however, a group of people, a relatively large group of people, who want to say that the historical stories in this are fact, and that this should be taught in schools as fact, as science, and as history. Now, the difference between them is that if you did decide to accept that Richard III was actually an absolutely accurate representation of what went on, that all those words that were spoken were actually spoken by the people, that all the events that happened in those plays all actually happened, it wouldn't really make much difference to us. If you think about it, that we'd all still be, it wouldn't change much of the way life was. It wouldn't affect much of other scholarship. But if you accept that the Earth was created in 6 days, 6,000 years ago, you have to throw away most of the things we know. And that's the argument that really, what the argument about creationism is about. It is not an argument about religion. People are allowed to believe whatever they like. And that's the way it should be. And we're lucky, we live in a country that's had freedom from religion from day one. Our constitution is in fact stronger than the United States in the separation of church and state. But there are people who want to take what is a religious text and pretending that they're not being religious, turn it into some kind of science textbook. The people who wrote this didn't intend it to be that. They intended it to be something else. In the same way that Shakespeare didn't intend to be writing factual stories and factual historical stuff. He was writing plays to entertain people and give a message. And so that's the difference. Now, just like to give you an idea, people say, I've had people say, well, what really, how can you say this book is so important to our society? Got a little test. I'm going to read out a list of names. If you have one of these names, is one of your given names, like to put your hand up. If you have 2 of them, put 2 hands up. And also count in your immediate family. That is your mother and father, your brothers and sisters, and your sons and daughters. And remember that these are all male names, but there are female versions of these names. I'll read these names out. If you've got one of these names, put your hand up. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, Simon. This is a group of people, the Skeptics conference, we're all named after the apostles. By the way, keep your hands up. Just for a little bit extra, add Paul. Yeah, well, nobody's got that. Thaddeus is mentioned in Matthew, but Thaddeus is not mentioned in Luke. And I'm reading Luke. So we're not getting into a discussion about inconsistency. Now I want you to think of this. Has anybody in their life ever met anybody called Judas? We have 4 speakers tonight. Right, that doesn't influence at all this book, does it? We have 4 speakers tonight. We have a paleontologist, Dr. Paul Willis. We have an astronomer, Dr. Phil Plait. We have a theologian, Dr. David Millikan. And we have an anthropologist, Professor Colin. And what we're going to do is get those people up here in that order. We'll give a presentation of about 6, 7, 8 minutes until I get tired of hearing them. Well, I start repeating themselves. To say why, the first thing is to say why they accept evolution. Then they're going to get them to speak again and say why they reject creationism. They aren't the same thing. So there's a reason for accepting something. That isn't the same as rejecting something. Whereas this is always put as an either-or argument by the creationists. If you don't believe this, you are some kind of heathen. So we're asking people, so why do they accept something? Why do they reject the alternative? Well, actually, David Millikan, who is, people would actually consider the odd man out here being a theologian amongst all this other stuff, right? Because actually wants to give his ones the other way around, which is perfectly consistent with being the only theologian amongst the group. Scientists. Although, I don't know, theology might be science these days. It's got part of the Greek word for science in it. So, well, the first person I introduce is Dr. Paul Willis. Most people would know Paul. He's on television. He's everywhere. For some reason or other, he's not wearing a bright shirt tonight, which disappoints me a little. So, Paul, would you like to come and give your first presentation?
What was the right shirt? Now I'm worried. I wasn't worried at all. Look, there are many things that I could bring up as to why I accept evolution and an ancient history of the Earth. And I thought probably the best thing to do is, rather than try and hit you with all of them in 6 minutes, actually I thought I had 10, so I prepared for 20, but what I thought I'd do is I'd follow through one train of thought on one idea, and I want to explain to you why I accept that the world is old. Now, this doesn't rely on university training or anything. This was stuff I figured out when I was 10 years old. And I want you guys to
I'm not the president for nothing, mate.
Switch it on, we want to see you.
You want to see me Tuesday at 8 o'clock, Thursday night's ABC. As I said, a 10-year-old could come up with it because that's what happened with me. That's broken. No, go away, I don't want you.
Put the light
Okay, right.
Put the light on.
We used to go to the beach. We were English kids, right? So you'd come out and you'd hit this wonderful stretch of sand on the beaches. This is Turramurra Head at Sydney. And the first thing my brother would do was pretend that he was an Australian and go swimming in the surf and get bitten by things and pummeled and all that. I decided that what I wanted to do as soon as I hit the beach was hit the headlands. The headlands on the northern beaches of Sydney are a wonderful place to find things like this. These are fossils of a plant called Phylotheca. Yeah, you can see the sort of radiating bamboo-like patterns in this rock. And you can also find fossil ferns in this area. And another thing you can find if you look are these are worm burrows, fossilised worm burrows in the rocks. I was one of those kind of kids who thought this was fascinating stuff. And it got me thinking as to, well, what are these things doing here? You can see at the bottom of the picture of the pieces of rock that have fallen out of the cliff face, and you can actually trace the types of rock back into the cliff to see where they've come from. Now those plant fossils come from the black stuff at the bottom of the cliff there. And, well, how do they get to be there? Well, one of the things you realise quite quickly is that they occur there because they were in a very quiet environment. There's a very simple experiment. Here's one that I prepared earlier. This morning, I got out of bed.
Turn the light on.
Technology. This morning, I Come on, okay.
Leave.
This morning I got out of bed. My wife! I got out of bed, I got a handful of sand, a handful of mucky clay dirt, and a handful of rocks, and I stuck them in here. I haven't shaken them up. Put some water in there, and give it a good shake. Now I'll leave this out the front, and you can check it out later on, and I'll just sort of slow it down and leave it there. What you will see, again, an experiment a 5-year-old could do, is that as you take the energy out of that system, that shaking it up gets all of that sediment moving. But as it settles down, as the energy decreases in the system, as the stream flow would flow down if it was a running stream, the first things to fall out are the big rocks, because the stream hasn't got enough energy to carry them. And as the stream energy decreases, then smaller and smaller particles come out, until the very fine stuff, the very finest clays, will only come out after weeks of that water being still. So when you see fine-grained rocks like the stuff at the bottom where those plant fossils were found, you know that they had to have been laid down in very quiet situations. Also the fact that they form layers, and with a bit of luck we will see some layers forming in this jar over here as the evening progresses. The fact that it's in layers tells you that there was a systematic laying down in very quiet situations. There's another great piece of evidence, because just across from where that photo was taken, you can see these ripple marks in this very fine silty rock. You can actually do measurements between the crests of those things and how high they are, and you can compare it to a modern environment where the same grain size is being laid down, and those ripples will tell you how fast the water was moving when it was laid down, and it was moving very, very slowly. Otherwise these things cannot form. Okay, so how old are these things? That's how I got to be there. They were in a quiet environment. But how old are they? Very simple thought experiment. Those plants are laid down in rocks at the bottom. The worm burrows and the ripple marks are on this set of rocks that are just jutting out the edge here. So that's all quiet water down there. Up on top, we've got more rock. But that's a sandstone. That's got bigger grain size in it, which means that there was more energy in the system when those things were being laid down. So you're looking at some time to put all of that rock on top of those plants. Let's follow through on that thought experiment. How much rock is on top of those plants? Well, as you're walking away from the beach, you can look across the various headlands going south, and you'll see that the rock layers are actually going down. You'll see that the dark unit of rock that the plants are in are at the bottom of this headland here, and then the one in the background, they actually only form the rock platform because the beds are dipping down. You can follow that right the way down to Bondi, and it's layers upon layers of rock, all dipping down. Now, the stuff on top has to be put there after the stuff on the bottom. If the stuff on the bottom's there, the stuff on top's got nothing to sit on. So it's got to be getting younger as you're going across these rocks. How thick are this sequence of rocks? Well, on top of them, this is sort of like, there's going to be a set of steak knives in there somewhere. Not only do you get that, on top of them, right where I used to live, this is a rock cutting at Barara on the old highway. You go down the new highway now, there's much deeper rock cuttings which will make a much more powerful point, but that's not what I want to do. This is what I saw when I was 10 years old. You see layers of sandstone. Again, sands are laid down in a reasonably high energy environment. There has to be a reasonable amount of water passing to move sand and making the shapes. There's not only layers here that you can see going across the screen, but if you look closely, you'll actually see that there's a second set of layers that run diagonally within each band. What's going on there is you're looking at a sandbar, and as more sand has come across, it's laid another layer, and then another layer, another layer, another layer. You get this series of diagonal layers created. And then, after a while, you get another sandbar forming on top. So you're looking at a large slice of time there for one sandbar to move across the bottom, and then another sandbar to move across the top of that, and then another one across the top of that. You can actually see cross-bedding a lot more easily in rock that's eroded. This is up in the Blue Mountains, and you can actually start to see some of those patterns forming. Okay, so we can actually see these sorts of structures forming in river estuaries today. So how many layers of this cross-bedding are sitting on top of my plants? Well, there's no better example than to look at this is Govern's Leap in the Blue Mountains. You can see the layers there. This is all sand. This is all cross-bedded sandstone. It has to have been laid down consistently by these sandbars moving across, and then another sandbar moving across, another sandbar moving across. Perhaps we're looking at maybe just a couple of feet forming each couple of 100 years, maybe a couple of 1,000 years before the next sandbar comes across. So how deep is that? Well, wait, there's more. Because if you look across the top of the Blue Mountains, you'll see things like there are hills that stick up. That one that you can see there is Mount Hay. There are other ones, such as Mount Tomar and Mount Wilson. There's about half a dozen in the mountains that have a different kind of rock on top. Here we are at Mount Tomar Botanic Gardens. I thought I needed a signpost somewhere along here to help me along the way. And the rock that you can see here has been dug out of the site. It's a different kind of rock. It's not those sandstones, it's not the siltstones that the plants are in at the bottom of this whole mess. It's basalt. We know how basalt forms. We can watch it happen today. You go to Hawaii, it's lava that has come out of a volcano. It's a liquid rock that sets and forms basalt. Now think about that problem. This basalt is on the top of half a dozen hills scattered across the top of the Blue Mountains, and it formed from a liquid rock. Liquids don't flow and stay on the top of things, they flow in the bottom. So why is this basalt sitting on the top of these hills? It's because when it was a liquid rock, where it is now was the bottom of a valley. That liquid has run down that valley and set. And because it's harder than the surrounding rock, the rest of the rock erodes away, leaving these hills sticking up. Couple more things before I leave you to contemplate how old these plants are that are stuck underneath all those rocks with these liquid rocks sitting on top of them. Those basalt-capped hills are separated by gorges like that. So they had to have formed before the gorge formed. And how long does it take to form a gorge like that? Now, as a mere 10-year-old, I wasn't prepared to put years, as I was sitting there on the beach, sort of exhausted with my fossils in front of me for my day's collecting, I wasn't prepared to sit there and say, well, this had to be, 239.2 million years. I was never bold enough to do that. But plainly I could see, as a child, that the rocks before me told me that the world had to be very, very old. We know now that the plant fossils that we saw at the beginning of the talk are somewhere in the vicinity of about 220, 230 million years old. The basalt on top of this whole system are 17 million years old and can be measured very accurately using radiometric dating. But the dates themselves don't matter to me. I'm satisfied by looking at that evidence that the world is an old place and this is an old system. I could, if I was given a full hour, I could give you examples going further down in this rock sequence to even older life that's sitting down the bottom. I could go into more detail as to how the system has to be even older because the structures that you see need time to form. The great shame for me when I'm debating creationists, or even when I'm talking about people who are talking to people who are geologically ignorant, is that there are so many simple lines of evidence that you walk on every day, that if you just knew how to read them would make you appreciate that we live on a very, very old planet. And that we've been around here, or that the rocks have been around for millions upon millions of years. What do the creationists have to say about that? Well, that's what I'll be talking about a little later in the evening. Thank you very much.
The next speaker is actually our guest for the entire conference, astronomer Dr. Phil Plait.
Don't clap until you heard what I have to say. I actually had combined, when I prepared for this, I combined why, what I was going to say about why I feel that the universe is old, as well as why I think the claims that it's young are incorrect. Is it possible to combine these now, or should I try to separate them because they may be immiscible? Okay. What I usually do when I approach a topic like this, and there are quite a few of them, you'll hear about this tomorrow when I talk about the moon hoax as well, is pretty much what Peter was talking about. I look and say, why are the claims made potentially incorrect, or at least, or if they are incorrect, what is it about them that's wrong? And at the same time, or later on, say, well, why is it that we know what we do know? And sometimes I don't even bother with why do we know what we do know, because it's sometimes enough just to show that the claims that these people make are incorrect. And Moonhoax is a good example of that. And I do have a whole hour of that big mark, so I won't worry about that now. As far as creationism goes, and evolution, I'm an astronomer, okay? I don't know that much about evolution any more than any other educated layman would know about it. There are people who have been trained in the tools of science, and they make claims about evolution, and I don't like to make arguments from authority. And so I'm not going to just say I believe them, especially since, as I've said before, I don't believe in anything. And I'm asked this a lot, do you believe in evolution? Do you believe the universe is old? And I say no, and they're surprised. And I say, it's because I don't believe in anything, because belief involves faith. And I don't have faith because faith means accepting something without evidence. And I accept nothing without evidence, except whatever psychological issues I might have with things that'll disallow me from seeing my own blind spots. But, I need evidence before I can make up my mind on something, on some new claim, I'll say that. Any entrenched claims I have, I'm not going to worry about. And so, I don't believe in anything. Michael Shermer has a complicated definition of what science is, but it talks about putting provisional acceptance to a theory. In other words, if somebody makes a claim, I will accept it provisionally, the provision being that if you give me evidence that looks good, I'll say, well, okay, I'll believe your theory until further evidence comes along that may deny it. And I feel very strongly about this. This is a good idea. And so you don't believe in something, you just give provisional acceptance to it. And that's true in science, but you have to define what provision means. Is it provisional acceptance at the 50% level, so that's like, not so good? Or is it provisional at the 99.9999999% level? As far as the old age of the universe, I'm going to go with the latter. The heavens themselves declare the old age of the universe, in my opinion. And astronomy gives us lots of evidence about the old age of the universe. And again, I want to say that I'm not going to tackle evolution here, even though that's part of the paneling. My teachers used to always give me grief that I was always twisting the assignments that I was given, and I'm going to do it here tonight. But given that I'm in the wrong hemisphere and my eustachian tubes are flowing in the Coriolis effect the wrong way, I'm going to give myself an allowance for this. And I'm sorry I don't have any pictures. Astronomers are used to waving their hands a lot, and given the problems we have with the computer, I think it's probably a good idea. As far as astronomy goes, okay, if we're going to make a claim that the universe is 6,000 years old, or we're going to make a claim that the universe is X billions of years old, 14 or so, what is the evidence of this? Astronomy is a relatively broad subject. And so if I were to think to myself, well, let's talk about why I think the universe is old, I'd have you here until we were all 14 billion years old ourselves. I could talk about star formation, planetary rotation, the recession of the moon, star cluster dynamics, universal expansion, radioactive decay and supernovae remnants, as well as in meteorite and asteroid samples, active galaxy jet formation, time dilation and supernovae light curves, solar fusion, the oscillations on the sun's surface, galaxy collisions, Oort cloud comets, and gaps in asteroidal orbit resonances. But we'll ignore all those. Any one of which can indicate that the universe is very old, at least more than 6,000 years. And what I'm going to concentrate on is an example that I gave in my book, available in the lobby for just $25 less than. And that is supernovae remnants. I have a little bit of history with these guys. I've studied supernovae for many years. And the way I'm going to tackle this is I'm going to give you a claim given by the Institute for Creation Research, and then extrapolate it to a creation result in general. Now the idea here is that stars more massive than the sun, much more massive, say 10 to 20 solar masses, do not go gently into that good night when they die. They actually rage against it. They explode. Okay? The core collapses and it forms a black hole, blah, blah, blah. We don't have to go into that. What's interesting here is what happens to the outer layers of this star. There is a tremendous amount of energy that is dumped into these outer layers, so much so that they explode outwards, and they can explode outwards at a large fraction of the speed of light. As they expand, things happen. Okay, they cool, for example. Radioactive elements are created, and so you're starting a clock, and that clock starts ticking, and this is radioactive decay. and you can measure in the laboratory that these elements decay over a certain amount of time, and then you can look in the supernova remnant, which is the expanding debris, it's the name of the expanding debris, and you can see how old it is by looking at how much of these radioactive elements are in it. That typically is good for a few hundred or a few thousand years. But what's much simpler than this is a very simple relationship, and that is rate of expansion. It's a speed. And you can measure it in all sorts of units, and I'll use kilometers per second because that's what scientists use. And I have to say, I love Australia because I can finally use kilometers, I can finally use kilograms and Celsius, and people don't look at me like I've sprung a second head, so I like that. When you measure the initial expansion of these supernovae, you can get the expansion. It is a direct measurement using the Doppler shift, the same thing that the cops will use on you, or the coppers, I think you say here, I'm not actually sure, the police, whatever. Used to measure your velocity when you're speeding. Okay, as this stuff expands, there's a Doppler shift. You can measure this. You get a velocity, typically 5,000 kilometers per second. Very fast. You can cross the entire continent in less than a second, or roughly a second. As these things expand, they get bigger. Hence the word expand. Okay? If you can measure how big these things are, and you know how quickly they're expanding, you can measure their age. All right? Now, I won't go into details because I don't have time. There are lots of methods to measure how quickly these things are expanding. You can actually, on several supernovae remnants, you can measure this directly in the Crab Nebula, a northern hemisphere nebula, all that. We can actually see this expansion. And you can use the Doppler shift and know when this thing happened. And we know the date that this thing exploded. And you can actually measure when this thing, how fast it's moving, all sorts of things about it. And so I'm just saying this to give you the handle that we do understand supernovae remnants. We do know how quickly they expand. We can understand how old they are. The Institute for Creation Research has many, many claims on their website about how astronomy declares that the universe is actually less than roughly 10,000 years old. And there are examples by other people who use these supernovae remnants. What they say is, okay, using astronomy, there's this great webpage all about this. It's thousands of words long. Only a fraction of a percent of which are actually accurate. It's actually quite astonishing. They say that if you accept supernovae remnants, then there should be so many that are under a certain age, so many between two ages, and so many older than another age. And he says that, in fact, you should see X that are older than 100,000 years, and we see none older than this age, or 250,000 years, some large number. And then we should see a certain number younger than 10,000 years, and a certain number between 10 and 100. And the point he's making is that we just do not see enough old supernovae remnants, and we see none older than 100,000 years. And therefore, the universe must be young. And this is completely incorrect. It's totally wrong. What he says is, well, what's really happening, and I can't go into details because there's not time, is that as a supernova remnant ages, it cools. Okay? As it expands, it cools, because any expanding gas will cool. It's radiating away its heat in the form of light. And so as this thing gets older, it stops giving off visible light. There's an old adage that I use all the time in astronomy. A little kid is looking for, is on his hands and knees on a street corner, and a policeman comes up to him and says, "Son, what's wrong?" And he says, I lost some money. And the policeman says, "Well, where did you lose it?" And the kid says, "Way over there." And the policeman says, "Well, why are you searching here?" And he says, "Well, because the light is better." Okay, it's just in astronomy all the time. It's the same sort of thing with supernovae remnants, okay? If they're not emitting radiation, we don't see them, okay? Old supernovae remnants do not emit invisible light. They emit in radio waves. And what this guy does, and he uses horribly complex science and all these statistics, all of which are wrong, all of which are just, I think, in my opinion, are used just to show you that he knows what he's talking about, when he really doesn't. And what he's saying is that we don't see any old supernovae remnants. He's not being correct. A very brief search by me, which took only a few minutes on the web, found dozens of supernovae remnants, which are well over 100,000 years old, some of which may be hundreds of thousands of years old. And if you go to and these are just in our galaxy. If you look at other galaxies, we see bubbles of gas being pushed out by supernovae remnants, which are millions of years old. And so what he's saying is that if you ignore the old supernovae remnants, there are no old supernovae remnants. Okay, this is the argument. This is, in fact, the argument this guy is making. All right. Now, I'm going to extrapolate this because you can always say, as I said, one of the things you can do when somebody makes a claim is you can attack that claim and say, well, that claim is wrong. But you can't really extrapolate that to everything. Right? You can't just say that because this claim is wrong, because somebody's making this claim in the name of creationism. Creationism is wrong. You can't say that. However, we're using the same argument that we do see older supernovae remnants, really pretty much right there shows that the universe must be older than 6,000 years. Because again, we can directly measure how far away these things are, how quickly they're expanding, and therefore how old they are. And we see that these things, because the science is repeatable, we know these things are older than the purported 10,000 or 6,000 year old age of the universe. And that's why I think that the universe is an old place. And it's also why I think it's not a young place. If those two things are not, of course, that makes sense. But that's why I think that creationism is, in fact, wrong. I think that's one argument amongst a huge list of other ones. And I think when we're taking questions from the audience later, I think I'll be able to expand on that. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. When I was in America earlier this year with Linda, we actually went to the Institute for Creation Research. It was closed. This actually prevented me, that was probably divine intervention. This prevented me from being put into a very dissonant mental state. If it had been open, we would have had to go in. If we had to go in, we would have had to pay to go in. That's really more than business. Once I got in, I would have resented paying the money. I would have, of course, also tried not to be arrested. Having been arrested in Mexico, I wasn't going to arrest the San Diego cops as well. I figured the luck had run out. So I'm actually disappointed that I didn't get to go inside the Institute for Creation Research. But I've got the feeling that had I gone in there, I don't think I would have come out convinced. We actually found another museum up the road which was much better. Our next speaker is Dr. David Millikan, theologian. He used to work with the ABC, I believe, and is a Uniting Church. Is that correct? Right. David Millikan.
I must confess to a certain trepidation speaking here as a theologian amongst all you skeptics. So I appreciate your little exercise before. I feel a lot more encouraged to think that people with so many biblical names. Creationism, which I'm going to try and sort of define and talk about, is a well-known theological term which, in its general sense, describes the theological doctrine that God is the creator, ex nihilo, out of nothing, of all things which exist outside of herself. And this is a view held by Judaism, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Protestantism and Islam. But tonight, I guess what we have in mind is that narrower view which goes to the time and manner of God's creative activity. In its most restrictive form, it is often referred to, curiously, as creation science, and is the view that God, who I must now refer to in exclusively masculine term, created the world exactly as described in the first creation story, Genesis, in the Bible, which says that the earth originally existed as a pre-existent, formless, black, watery void. And in the space of 6 days, of 24 hours duration, God first created light. Then God created the cosmos beyond the earth, which we know as the universe, but which the writer of Genesis thought of as an elaborate sort of roof, which is translated as a vault. And on that vault, God placed stars, moon and sun, which moved in curious and interesting patterns across the roof. Following that, God created land, plants, birds, fish, animals, and finally human beings, which were made distinct from the rest of creation, bearing the image of God. Now I know a number of Christian people, not many, but I know more than I would have thought I should know, who believe this. And they believe that this happened 6,000 years ago. The same people believe that Enosh lived to be 807 years, Seth lived to 912 years, Methuselah to 969, and Lamech a paltry 770 years. They also believe that every bird, insect and animal was taken into Noah's Ark. Now what is astonishing, I guess, is that these people are not stupid, and they are not mad. They are good people. They hold these beliefs as consistent and with what they understand, with their understanding of faith generally. And they hold to these beliefs despite all argument, all evidence, and all attempts to show the internal inconsistencies of the position they hold. And in a sense, I guess, I hold what Karl Popper used to refer to as classically unfalsifiable theories. Their explanation for the age of Enosh and Seth is that they lived at a time when sin and evil had not yet infused the world with corruption to the point that people could then live beyond the normal lifespan today and up to nearly 1,000 years. Two, they believe that the proliferation of aged fossils and the arguments that we've already heard tonight were actually inventions by God, and that God has placed these fossils and other evidences of age within the universe as a test of our faith. And they believe that the animals and all the insects and other creatures that fitted into Noah's Ark fitted in because God shrank them, like the fallen angels in Milton's Paradise Lost, which he describes as shrinking down to the size of buzzing flies. So, I mean, it's easy to lampoon this theory, but what is harder to understand is why it is that people hold this view. And I'm sure some of you know the remarkable evidence of the number of university students, people, young students studying medicine and so on, who believe these theories and hold these theories at the same time that they participate in the normal processes of university education in Australia. I think they believe it because of three things. Well, I think there are more, but these are, I think, three potent reasons why this occurs. First, I think I see this as an effect of postmodernist epistemologies today. We have eroded the habit and capacity for us to form judgments about what is wrong in a communal sense. I've written books and made television programs about New Age, cults and the like. And I've been with people who believe in astral travelling, light healing, affirmations, past lives, and they are afforded equal credibility as the laws of thermodynamics. And we live in this sort of environment where people have lost the capacity, I think, to make clear judgments about what is right and wrong. And we're losing that sort of capacity, I think, for discerning what is intellectual horseshit. And it's a great shame because we hold these views and we lose the capacity to be able to judge when another person is getting it wrong. Secondly, the creationist view emerges out of a warped hermeneutic. By that I mean they have interpreted the Bible in ways that the Bible does not require. The Bible is, as we've already begun to hear tonight, is a complex mix of styles and ways of conveying its message. It contains poetry, it contains apocalyptic literature, and it contains myth. And each of those particular forms of literature require different methodologies in the way we interpret them. For example, in Revelation 4, here's the description of the four creatures around the throne of God. They had eyes covering them in front and behind. The first creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third had a human face, and the fourth was like an angel, and like an eagle in flight. And each had 6 wings and eyes all around and inside them. And this is from Luke 2. In those days, a decree was issued by the Emperor Augustus for a census to be taken, throughout the Roman world. This was the first registration of its kind, and it took place when Quirinius was governor of Syria. The inability to see that these are two different forms of expression requiring different forms of interpretation is what leads to the absurdities of the narrow creationist view. But I think this also hides something actually deeper. And there's a sort of cultural reason why I think creationism has emerged. And it is perhaps a reaction to the great liberal theological experiment that began in the middle of the 19th century, when people like F.C. Bauer and Hegel and Feuerbach and Friedrich Schleiermacher and the rest began a movement which we see in its final flowering in the work of the recent Bishop of New York, Shelby Spong. And what it is I see an attempt on the part of certain theologians and others to divest Christianity of its miraculous dimensions as a way of equipping Christianity to deal with the challenges of modern science. So Christianity has taken a battering in the last 150 years from the emergence of a whole range of scientific investigations. And there's a number of ways in which you can respond to that. And one of the ways is to say, well, the form of Christianity that we have been given today is really not what it's about. And that we have inherited in Christianity a whole set of superstitions that we should do away with. And so it becomes a type of deism, where God becomes like Aristotle's unmoved mover, a distant and aloof sort of character. And Shelby Spong, who I mention because he's a very popular sort of character, he has divested Christianity of all of these miraculous dimensions. He believes it exists without miracles, without divine response to prayer, except perhaps in instilling some sort of shift in psychological states, and ultimately no resurrection. Now, this is clearly, in the eyes of many Christians, a direct attack on the integrity of the Bible, because the Bible talks about those sort of things. It talks about miracles and talks clearly about the resurrection of Jesus. And in the 1920s there emerged the fundamentalist movement, and the fundamentalist movement was a response to this. And a group of theologians got together and they actually wrote down a series of points that they said were the fundamentals of Christianity that should never disappear, and thus the term fundamentalism emerged. They were the fundamentalists who had proposed these set of fundamental principles. So in a sense, creation emerges out of that attempt to defend the Bible and to defend the miraculous intervention of God in the world. And it is, in a sense, a massive and tragic overreaction. But it is a response to that. So that by saying that everything in the Bible is true is a way of defending the Bible. Say, well, because they believe that if you chip away just one little piece of it, then its ultimate infallibility is lost. And they don't want to step into the complexities of judging the Bible on those other broader and more complex terms. So, creationism, in its general sense, I would say I am a creationist. I believe that God created the cosmos out of nothing. But I do not accept creationism in its narrower forms. It is not justified by what the Bible says. It is self-contradictory, and it does not account for the evidence that is presented to us, and therefore it is wrong.
My piece of paper as well. The point that he's making at the end is interesting. I actually had someone say to me once that he was offended as a Christian by the use of the term creationist. He said, in fact, if you are a Christian, or if you're a Muslim, or if you're a Jew, you believe that God created the world. He says that doesn't mean that you believe that it was created 6,000 years ago. He said it's a function. He said, so maybe we need another term. It was really, yes, if you are a believer, you are a creationist. But you doesn't necessarily mean that you're a creationist of the extreme kind. We'd love to get Jack Spong here. That would draw a crowd. Our final speaker, though they're all supposed to speak again, is anthropologist Professor Colin Groves.
Evolution is not something that one believes in, it just is. It follows inevitably from the laws of genetics. I had a geneticist say something like this a few years ago, and it's a good way of looking at it. Genetics involve mutation, selection and drift, and those together are what we call evolution. So we'll go right in and talk about human evolution and the family Hominidae, which includes humans and so-called great apes. These are the results of the study of, I think, about 60 different loci in the genome of humans, chimpanzees, gorillas and orangutans, and measuring, therefore, the total genetic difference between them. And you see there is 1.24% difference between humans and chimpanzees, plus or minus 0.07, a little more between gorilla, and you note the difference between gorilla and human is the same. It's virtually the same as the difference between gorilla and chimpanzee. And this, I don't want to go into the complexities of the molecular plot, but you can see that there is a consistency in the amount of difference between them. Chimpanzees are therefore extremely close to us genetically, and we can suggest that there are corollaries of this. You would expect they might be psychologically close to us as well. And indeed, we find that they are. They use tools. Here's chimpanzees in Ivory Coast using stones to crack nuts. They make tools. Here's one inserting a tool into a tree to get a grub out. And here's the famous chimpanzees at Gombe National Park in Tanzania using grass stems, which they have modified. In other words, they've made an extremely simple tool to get termites out. And chimpanzees and very few gorillas and orangutans have also been involved in this language-like training to communicate. And here's Kanzi, the pygmy chimpanzee, or bonobo, who is hearing through his earphones an instruction from somebody in a soundproof box far away, and he then touches the item on the screen and then goes and collects the object which he's been instructed to do so. So if these similarities are due to evolution, you'd expect to find, wouldn't you, intermediates in the fossil record between great apes, various great apes, and us. You'd expect to find that human fossils are further back in time, and they're less like us, more ape-like the further you go back. So here's some differences between human and chimpanzee. First of all, big brain, chin, small canines in the human, the upright posture, and parabolic dental arcade. The lower one instead of the upper one, the rectangular dental arcade with the big canines. So here is a graph of brain size as represented by cranial capacity. That's the volume inside the skull. And you can see the way that we don't have enough complete fossils, more than about 2.5 million years old. But you can see the way the brain size increases seamlessly as you go up through time. The earliest ones have the same brain size as chimpanzees. There are some blue ones, sorry, more than 3 million, just a few, and they haven't shown up in this particular slide. We can look at the evolution of the chin, and we can see that in an intermediate species, you see the chin is less receding than in the chimpanzee, but not prominent like in us, modern humans. We can see the shape of the dental arcade and the canine, and we can see that Australopithecus afarensis, which in this particular specimen is 3.7 million years old, is intermediate in the shape of the dental arcade, in the size of the canine, in all sorts of other characters. When we look at upright posture, chimpanzee, Australopithecus, the so-called Australopithecines are intermediate in time, existing between about 4 million and say 1.5 million years ago. And we can see that the Australopithecines and humans share a low, wide pelvis, different from the chimpanzee, suggesting upright posture, bipedalism. Only modern humans have a long femur, so Australopithecus is intermediate in having a more human-like pelvis, but a short thigh like chimpanzees. And then the so-called valgus knee. You notice how we are knock-kneed, whereas in chimpanzees go straight downwards. So our centre of gravity is underneath the body, and the Australopithecus is like us in that. So we get intermediates indeed in the fossil record. Here's the story of canine reduction from Australopithecus cadaver to Australopithecus ramidus to Australopithecus afarensis, gradual reduction in size of the point of the canine, intermediates. And then when we look at the approximate timeline, 3 million years old, small brain, very prognathous, large jaws. 2 million years old, larger brain, jaws receding. 1.5 million years old, brain enlarging, face recessed, jaws much smaller. Homo heidelbergensis, about 500,000 years old, and finally Homo sapiens. You see, it's a sort of gradual consistency. Human evolution is, as I've said before, a seamless thing. There are no breaks in the sequence. You get bipedalism developing throughout the sequence, canine reduction developing throughout the sequence, just at slightly different rates, which is called mosaic evolution. Jaw reduction progresses throughout the record. Brains, again, increase in size, again, throughout the record. And again, all these things take place at slightly different rates. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of human evolution. And I'll come on later to what creationists say about it. Thank you.
Can I make it fit? Does it make sense? Now, so I went up to the headland and I started looking at the fossil plants for a start. Now, as you'll notice when you come out and look here, there is some vegetable matter and it's all floating on the top. Now, creationists will tell you that sedimentary rocks like these, all the sedimentary rocks were made, at least most of them, the great majority of them, were made during the Great Flood. In a period of just around about a year, all of the sedimentary rocks in the world were laid down. So these plants had to have been laid down sometime in that Great Flood. So there was enough energy in the system to bury these guys. But hang on, there was also worms living down in there as well. So I'm starting to have some problems here. How do you combine the fact that the plant matter is going to float with the idea that you've got lots and lots of rock and somehow way down the bottom of it there's worms living down there sifting up the sediment? That doesn't make sense to me. If you look at the rocks here, what I was saying earlier on about the fact that down the bottom you've got this fine-grained rock which has to have been laid down in quiet water. You've got this other evidence of quiet water down the bottom in the ripple marks. When you look back at the cliff, you've got more high-energy water above it. The only way I can kind of cram that into a creationist model is that, well, sometime during the Great Flood, it got a bit quiet for a couple of days. So that you could really lay down these very fine-grained rocks and perhaps some waterlogged plant material came down, and that's the fossils down there. And then it all picked up again and laid down the rest of these rocks, not just, you know, a couple of feet of them. When you actually add or the sequence of rocks that sits on top of those plants, it comes out to somewhere about 2.5 kilometres of rock was laid down on top of those fossil plants. If I was to go the other way, by the way, in this sequence, I could take you right the way back to coal measures that outcrop in Newcastle, which are a good deal older than that. So somehow the plant material had to be buried before you put in all of these rocks that were of much higher energy. So the atonement that it would have been to create all of that energy to deposit all of that rock somehow was quite enough in the early days to lay down plant fossils, and that wasn't making sense. The cross-bedding. We know that this occurs in the mouth of very large rivers, and we can see it forming today. The idea that you could lay down that amount of sandstone, and this is only a small fraction of it, the idea that you could lay down that amount in just a year with these cross-bedding structures doesn't add up. There's no way that you can move sand. You need a higher energy to move the quantity of material, but as soon as you put that energy to move the quantity of material in place, you're going to move more than sand. You're going to be moving rocks and boulders and large pieces as well. It's not going to be the well-sorted sand. So there's no way you can have cross-bedding on top of cross-bedding on top of cross-bedding for, as we see here, a couple of kilometres thick, sitting on top of those plant fossils down the bottom. So what the teacher was telling me that the world was 6,000 to 10,000 years old, that these rocks had all formed within 1 year in the Great Flood, didn't make sense. I can see many millions of years just looking at the side of that cliff in order to make it, to lay those rocks down as many millions of years, much more than the time allowed for by the strict creationist model. What about the basalt on top of the hills? Creationists do not doubt and do not question the fact that basalt comes from liquid rock. I have yet to hear them put forward a convincing argument as to why, in the Blue Mountains and in other places around the world, this liquid rock is sitting on top of hills. They can't explain that you must have had that rock running down the bottom of valleys, and yet it's sitting on top of hills, the rest of it eroded away. Unfortunately, they're then running rates of erosion at such a high rate, and so only 4,000 years ago, that we should still be able to see these hills eroding today by many feet per day if those rates were holding true. And I haven't seen that. So the evidence doesn't stack up there. They will come up with arguments as to how you make a valley this size in a very short period of time. What they would say is that that amount of rock had been laid down in the flood because of all the floodwaters going down, lots and lots of sediment. You make it, yes, you can make piles of rock or sediment that are 2 or 3 kilometres thick. And before it sets, as the water drains away at the end of the flood, it carves these valleys into unconsolidated sediment that then becomes rock. Now the thing is that if that were true, well, you've only got to think about a pile of sand in your backyard. You try creating a pile of sand that has a vertical face of 100 metres. You can't do it. There's no way that model makes sense when you're sitting in the backyard playing around in a sand pit. So the evidence that was before me, the evidence that I can go out and I can test and I can look at and I can reproduce, cannot be fitted within the model that the creationists were giving me. And that's why, on this score, I have to reject creationism.
Thanks, Paul. What about those fossils on top of Mount Everest?
God did it.
God did it. I knew there was an answer.
You've got me.
I knew there was an answer to that one. Do you want to speak again, Bill?
Yeah.
I'll keep it relatively brief. While Reverend Millikan was speaking, I was thinking about one of my favorite movies, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. After the characters have seen their flying saucers, and the military comes in to debunk what they've seen, wind up agreeing with Richard Dreyfuss's character at one point, and he says, "You can't confuse us by agreeing with us." And so, I'm going to turn this around a little bit, and wind up agreeing with the Reverend here in a moment, and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you how and why in a moment. We're talking about several different issues here, and it caused me a little bit of confusion. For example, we talked about the term creationism, and there are young Earth creationists, and they say, by God, right, the universe is 6,000 years old. There are old Earth creationists who say that, in fact, the universe is old, as scientific evidence suggests, but that we're not interpreting the Bible correctly. The Bible actually indicates that the universe is old because the 6 days of creation can't really be days for various reasons. One is that perhaps the earth hadn't been created yet, so you can't have a day without the earth. And I'm reading a book right now called A Matter of Days, where an old earth creationist is trying to, it's a series of apologetics basically, saying that we're misinterpreting the Bible, the definition of the word day, and various things. And there's an old phrase that an agnostic is an atheist without the conviction of his belief. And I think that I can say the same thing that an old earth creationist is a young earth creationist without the conviction of his belief. And it's funny because, in a sense, if I can use another biblical metaphor, this guy in this book is trying to count how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. He's using sort of semantic arguments to form a bridge between what we observe and what we can read in the Bible, and it doesn't work. The book doesn't work. I'll spoil another part of the book that I wrote too, and give you a joke that's a standard joke, and many of you have probably heard it. If you've all heard it, I'll just sit down. But as the story goes, and there's always a different astronomer. Some people say it's Eddington, some others say it's Stephen Hawking, which tells you that this story probably never really happened. It's apocryphal. But the idea is that there's an astronomer giving a lecture about the universe and cosmology, and he goes on and on for an hour or two, and then he asks for questions, and then a little old lady in the back of the room raises her hand, and she says, "You can't fool me." She says, "I know that the universe is actually a ball that rests on the back of a turtle." And he says, "Ah, dear lady, but what is that turtle standing on?" And she says, "You can't get me that way either. It's turtles all the way down." And you can see this. You can search on turtles all the way down on the web, and you'll see this attributed to 100 different astronomers. And so, a lot of astronomers make this argument. Okay, I in fact feel that I give my provisional acceptance to the idea that the universe was created ex nihilo, or at least it was created out of some state of which we can know nothing about. And if you want to call that nothing, or out of the void, I suppose that's okay. There are quantum theories, there are superstring theories, there are these brain theories, short for membrane, that posit meta-universes, and they smash together and form our universe. And this stuff is all really good if you're in grad school and smoking pot and talking about it at 3 in the morning. And they may very well be true. But be that as it may, we feel, we perhaps are investigating that the universe may have been created out of something else. And it's possible that we cannot know anything about what it was created out of. It's possible that we can. As a matter of fact, the Big Bang makes a prediction about a certain type of wave called a gravitational wave. These crashing membrane theories make a different prediction about what these gravitational waves look like. And it's possible in the next 20 years that we can send up a satellite and measure these gravitational waves and say, this one's right, this one's wrong. And it's quite possible that it might say the Big Bang is right and the brain theory is wrong. And then again, we're stuck with this idea that the universe popped into existence out of nothing. Quantum fluctuation. Oof, there it is. And so scientists find themselves in the interesting situation that they are agreeing with creationists in that the universe was created out of nothing. Then scientists sort of take a cold heart in the idea that it's not turtles all the way down. If you want to posit a God that created the universe, what created the God? I think that's a legitimate logical argument. And you can say God always existed. You say, well, then why can't we just posit that the universe always existed? And so at some point, we're going to be arguing how many angels dance on the head of a pin. And I want to stress, okay, this is interesting, because I want to stress that, in fact, scientists do agree with creationists in this situation. The universe may have been created out of nothing. And I'm constantly approached by pseudoscientists who tell me I have a closed mind. And they say, you don't believe in UFOs. And I say, that's not true. They say, show me some evidence that there's a flying saucer actually landing here, and I will give it provisional acceptance. All you've shown me are blurry photos. People say, you don't believe in Planet X. And I say, show me the existence of this 10th planet, which swings by the Earth and destroys it every 3,600 years. Okay? I'm the one with a closed mind. But they're the ones who won't give me the evidence and who absolutely say that what they're saying is true, despite all of the scientific evidence that I'm giving them. And I'm, in fact, the one with the open mind, because I'm saying, give me the evidence. I will change my mind if your evidence is better than my evidence. I've done it. Okay? I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I have done it. And so I'm going to tell you something right now. I cannot, as a scientist, disprove that there is a God that created the universe X number of years ago. You make it 1 billion or you make it 6,000. Okay? In fact, if you want to talk about old Earth creationism, could there be a God that created the Big Bang 14 billion years ago, gave it the characteristics that we see today? I can't disprove that. I can't accept it because there's no evidence for it, for me. It's something you have to take on faith. And of course, that's the basis of religion, but not science. Can I accept that there was a God that created the universe 6,000 years ago? Well, as we've been pointing out, no. Okay? The universe must be older than 6,000 years. If you accept that the universe is 6,000 years, you have to deny the evidence. Or you have to assume that the evidence is somehow being misinterpreted by us. And there's a lot of claims about this made by different young Earth creationists, that the speed of light is changing, and that there's this and that perhaps it means that the universe is 6,000 years old. And I say that this is last Thursdayism. Okay? And I was talking about this with somebody last night, as a matter of fact. That the universe was created last Thursday, and all of our memories were placed into our brain, making it look like it's very old. The light from distant quasars was put on its way already here. Things are made to look evolved. Things are made to look like they've been changing with time. And I think that, I make a joke about this, and I say that I don't think, if you believe in the God of the Bible, that God wouldn't do this, because that's very deceptive. And, there is a character in the Bible who is very deceptive, and it's not God. So, you may be looking in the wrong direction in this particular case. And so I just want to say that, in fact, okay, as a true scientist, and I feel like I'm Ellie Arroway at the end of the movie Contact here. As a true scientist, I cannot say God did not create the universe. Okay? And so I find myself agreeing with Reverend Millikan, and I was surprised to see, to listen to what you said. It made a certain amount of sense to me, and so I'd like to end with that and say that there is a point where we agree, and it's actually possible that in the next few decades we may be able to test the difference between a universe ex nihilo and a universe ex something else. Thank you.
Professor Victor Stenger, who used to be at the University of Hawaii, now retired, wrote a book where he was trying to prove the non-existence of God. He didn't actually call it that. But what he did was he invented what I call the physics of the gaps. And he invented all these other universes we can't ever possibly detect, but they're there. But his best answer for the first cause argument, and what started was that time is in fact zero-sum symmetrical across the Big Bang, and the other side of it was just going the other way. And people who were there, they see this infinite universe in front of them and a limited one behind them, just like we do. And I thought, this sounded like he was just making this stuff up. But I found that if you try to criticise this man, you receive an enormous amount of hate mail. David, you have the other way around and say why you believe in evolution.
Well, like Phil, I'm going to propose a provisional belief in evolution. But let me begin by raising what I think is one of the issues that I find unexplained at the moment within the current theories of evolution. Although I regard the evolutionary theory to be an elegant theory that accounts for the biological evolution of human beings. But let me give you a couple of examples. Peter Singer, who you perhaps know as one of Australia's most famous philosophers and is always in trouble. And recently he's now teaching at Princeton, and he's in trouble because he holds to a form, an unusual form of utilitarianism, in which he argues that human beings have no intrinsic dignity or value and cannot be said to be qualitatively different from any other creatures in the world, thus allowing him to say that killing a newborn baby or a radically incapacitated person is morally justified. Steven Pinker, who is Professor of Psychology at MIT, he argues that in a similar sort of way, that personhood is a matter of degree distinguished by what he calls morally significant traits. So these traits would be things like memories, a sense of communal responsibility and so forth. And he argues that these traits are learned and that immature neonates don't possess these traits any more than a mouse. So, in the same way that Singer does, he would argue that newborns are not fully human and taking their lives is not as philosophically indefensible as many would argue. Now, I have a friend who's been a Scientologist for about 15 years. His name is Henry. He's a good friend of mine. And he believes that the essential ingredient that makes up an individual is what he calls a thetan. So he refers to, as also Scientologists do, they refer to their bodies as meat. They have an extremely disrespectful view of the physical nature of this world. They talk about it as the meat world. And that the essential focus of Scientology is on the life of the thetans, which are pre-existent and that have existed, in fact, into eternity. And the key of Scientology is an event that occurred some 70 million years ago, which I'm not allowed to talk about because it's secret, and if you do, you can get in serious trouble. But he has so his interest in this world is provisional, and he sees himself as having other lives going on and on. Finally, let me draw your attention to the death of Socrates and the death of Jesus. If you want to read about the death of Socrates, you can go down to a shop and buy a paperback called the Phaedo. And it's a small, elegant little book that talks about the death of this great philosopher who chose to commit suicide rather than be exiled from Athens because he was accused of atheism and leading the young men of Athens astray. Now, you have an account in that book of Socrates' death, and it's a gracious, noble death. He faces death with equanimity and with grace, with not a tremor of fear. And in fact, his last words as the hemlock takes effect is, tell Practius that I owe him a cockerel, which is always struck me as ironic for the great Socrates' last words. But, so he dies. He dies at peace. Compare that with the death of Jesus. In the garden, he is in agony. And he is in struggle and turmoil. Now, why is it that Socrates faces death with equanimity and Jesus doesn't? The reason is that Socrates believes in immortality of the soul and Jesus doesn't. He believes in resurrection of the body, a fundamental and unique Christian understanding. A lot of Christians think that we believe in immortality of the soul, but in fact, if you know the Apostles' Creed, it is we believe in resurrection of the body and the life everlasting. Now, this takes me to my interest in the theory of evolution and where I really look for some assistance because I don't know the answer to my queries. Because I want to believe in the theory of evolution and I want it to account for all of the phenomena that I see because it seems like an adequate and important theory. But what I see is at stake is the concept of the soul. Now recently there was a book written by Brown, Murphy and Newt Maloney called Whatever Happened to the Soul. And these are a group of interesting theologians who say this at the beginning of the book. We have written from the perspective that views soul as a functional capacity of a complex physical organism rather than a separate spiritual essence that somehow inhabits a body. Now maybe they are right, but that strikes me as a very interesting but very radical thought. They are arguing that by examining the physical reality of human beings, you can account for everything associated with human beings, including the nature of the soul itself, or even the existence of the soul. So you have two questions. You have the ontological question as to whether or not the soul actually does exist. And the other question, which is the epistemological question, if you like, as to what it means and what's the point of it. So maybe, from my point of view as a Christian, maybe God created the cosmos at the Big Bang and set in motion in that process an inevitable movement such that at a certain point the emergence of human beings with a soul would be part of the whole process. Maybe that's the explanation, or maybe God set it going and intervened to do this. I am not, you probably gather, I'm not philosophically squeamish about the concept of the miraculous. I mean, after all, I believe in the resurrection of Jesus. I mean, I've got to. Well, a lot of theologians these days tend not to, but as a Uniting Church clergyman, I'd be in a lot of trouble if I didn't. Yes. So, but you see, I want to hang on to this concept of the soul, and I want to know how is it possible that the evolutionary process will account for that. Maybe we're looking at the evolutionary process as something that accounts for all the physical realities of the world, but that to import into it this other transcendental quality that distinguishes us as human beings, and which allows and which accounts for our hunger for immortality, or even the concept of immortality, or the idea of free will, or the possibility of a relationship between us and a God who is beyond the limitations of this world. I can't see that you can maintain those sort of theories without having some sort of understanding about the nature of the soul. So the problem is this. I do believe in the evolutionary theory, as I've said, but I am at a loss. I still don't know. I mean, since I've been working this talk up, I realise how extraordinarily ignorant I am on these issues. But the weight, what I do see is that the weight of contemporary science is largely reductionist and based on a physicalist position, namely that a person is in essence a physical body, and by examining the physical materials of this world, you have sufficient to provide an adequate explanation for these other aspects of human beings, which I associate with the concept of the soul. So, although physicalism does not logically entail atheism, because it is concerned with nature and God is beyond it, it does render accounts of the world which appeal to transcendental forces obsolete, because nothing beyond nature is required to explain the natural world if physicalism is true. So, insofar as I believe in evolution, it is provisional, provided I can find an explanation that allows me to persist in my belief that there is something about human beings that allows us to have this relationship with God. Thank you.
It's not often we get a chance to hear that sort of thing. Skeptical conference, I think it's welcome to hear that. It's interesting that there's a display at the Australian Museum, and it's sort of been having all sorts of museums, and it shows a child buried with flowers. And this is an indication that these people were like us. They were early humans. This was the movement between humans and something else. And it seemed as being when people started to think there may be an afterlife. So maybe this is something which is something that's involved in the humans in some way. But that's seen by people as evidence that these people were human, rather than these people were just wandering around the bush and looking like humans. They were burying their dead, with some kind of respect. Colin?
God is like this. Okay. Creationists mucking about with human evolution. Why shouldn't creationists dabble in human origins? Well, science is a process of finding out. Creation science, as they call it, is a process of confirming what you've already decided is true, not finding out. The procedures by which they operate are quite different. A scientist makes a hypothesis, tests it against the facts, and if the hypothesis doesn't fit, rejects or modifies the hypothesis. This is an ideal, of course. I regret to say I do know some scientists who have deviated from this idea. A creationist makes a hypothesis, tests it against the facts, and if the hypothesis doesn't fit, rejects the facts. So what do creationists make of human evolution in particular? Ever since Dwayne Gish, there have been several themes. Oh, Dwayne Gish, which are obligatory for all creationists to mention in their writings. If you've ever read any of the creationist books, especially those from the 80s and 90s, they've slightly got beyond this now, but again and again and again, you argue with people by email like this, you see it on the web. Again and again, all they're interested in human evolution is Piltdown Man, Nebraska Man, the disappearance of Peking Man, and what Lord Zuckerman said and what Charles Oxnard is supposed to say. So, very briefly, Piltdown Man, Eoanthropus dawsoni, there he is, supposed to be a man, described in 1912, found to be a hoax in 1952, was the star attraction in the evolutionary sky, and turned out to be a hoax. What hope have we of finding genuine fossils? It was just a medieval human brain case, combined with an orangutan jaw. As genuine discoveries accumulated, remember, it appeared more and more anomalous. Didn't fit with the genuine discoveries. It was finally tested and unmasked by people that creationists call evolutionists, not creationists. Creationists, incidentally, have set their own linguistic standards, and unfortunately they've forced us to use them. For me, an evolutionist is somebody who is interested in or studies evolutionary theory. You don't need a special word for somebody who believes in evolution. You call such a person a biologist. In the same way, as David Millikan just pointed out, they've also cornered the language by forcing us to use their meaning of creationists. So, Nebraska Man, Hesperopithecus Harold Cooki, was described in 1922 from a single tooth. There it is, there's the tooth. It was given a very imaginative reconstruction in a popular magazine, I regret to say. There we are, the Illustrated London News of 1922. Further excavations at the same site where it was found in Nebraska showed it to be from a fossil peccary. Again, it was the evolutionists, not creationists, who unmasked it and said, we don't, this doesn't belong in our family tree. Peking Man. Lots of specimens of what creationists call ape men were discovered at a site called Chogotien near Beijing between 1928 and 1936. And here are some of them here in the brain cases that are part of the discoveries. Very rich discoveries, but they were all lost during the Second World War when they were trying to take them out when the Japanese invaded China and they were trying to take them out to safekeeping in America. They were lost. How suspicious, say the creationists. Look, the evidence for human evolution, all these ape men, they don't exist anymore, but they're making it up all the time. A lot of creationists actually, who only read other creationists, say, yes, yes, they were making it up. Actually, more of them were discovered in 1959, 1966. The creationists will not tell you this. And then creationists love to quote Sir Solly Zuckerman, who was later Lord Zuckerman. And Lord Zuckerman lived to a great age. In the 1950s, he and a co-author, Ashton, co-authored a series of papers on the South African Australopithecines, which were being discovered during the 30s and 40s, saying they were nothing to do with humans. Creationists haven't forgotten that they said that. Bronowski and Long in 1952 pointed out that their findings were actually due to a statistical error in their paper. Zuckerman did not change his opinion because of this pointing out. During Zuckerman's visit to South Africa in the 1970s, Philip Tobias offered to show him the original Australopithecine fossils. Zuckerman refused the offer. He said, I've said all I'm going to say about Australopithecines. Creationists continue to quote Zuckerman. The last statement he made about the Australopithecines, never having seen any original fossils and not as a result of original work on them, was I think in 1972. So except for Ashton and originally Oxnard, whom I'll mention in a moment, Zuckerman was the only specialist to doubt the human affinities of the Australopithecines. When he died in 1993, at the age of about 93, I don't know how long, his views died with him. Creationists quote him as if he's a living being and the most important icon of paleoanthropology. Here's Charles Oxnard. Now, he's a personal friend of mine, and he is intensely irritated by what creationists say about him. He was a former student of Eric Ashton, Zuckerman's junior colleague, and in the 1970s, he did express doubts about the human affinities of the South African Australopithecines. He's backtracked somewhat from his views, and he now maintains an open mind. He's embarrassed and annoyed about the use creationists have made of his views. There are, of course, creationists who specialise in human origins. Marvin Lubenow, professor of Bible and apologetics at Christian Heritage College in San Diego, California. Jack Quatso, I don't know how you pronounce his name, who is an orthodontist. And then a genuinely anthropologically trained one, Sigrid Hartwig Scherer, who was trained in Zurich. Marvin Lubenow wrote this book, Bones of Contention, a creationist assessment of human fossils. And there are good points in the book. He doesn't try to downplay the vast amount of fossil material in the human fossil record, but he's ignorant of evolutionary theory, he misinterprets specialist statements, and he doesn't know all that much anatomy either. You read his book as a breath of fresh air after somebody like Dwayne Gish. Anything would be a fresh air. It gradually dawns upon him that he's sort of lost in the morass. Jack Quatso wrote an amazing book called Buried Alive, The Startling Truth About Neanderthal Man. Now he has good points. He's an excellent anatomist. Somebody who's trained as an orthodontist usually has some anatomical training too, and he's good. But the book is full of outrageous paranoia. It starts with his visits to Paris to see some fossils there, and he's convinced the evil evolutionists are after him, and you see he meets the same man in the streets twice. Now that is pretty solid evidence. And he meets some hoons who apparently chase him in a car and so on. And he proposes that Neanderthal people lived to vast ages. Who are they? But the immediate descendants of Shem after the flood, when people were still living to a few hundred years of age. And you can read the book and see how he argues that amazing case. Sigrid Hartwig Scherer wrote a book in German. I have some understanding of German, but I haven't read this book. It's about Ramapithecus. And Ramapithecus was a fossil from India and indeed Pakistan that was thought for a short while to be a Middle Miocene human ancestor. And it's now known that the special human line doesn't go back that far. More detailed analysis and later more complete material showed in fact Ramapithecus related to orangutans. And a few creationists in their books do talk a bit about Ramapithecus, and this, as far as I can gather, is just a sort of recounting of the story of thinking. New crypto-creationism is called intelligent design, and people who espouse intelligent design deny that they're creationists, but if you read their work, what is it but an attempt to introduce creationism by the back door, particularly with particular regard to education. So, here are the big three. Philip Johnson, he's a lawyer, who we of course know all about evolution and intelligent design. He's essentially the founder of intelligent design. This one is Michael Behe, who is a biochemist, and he has invented a principle called irreducible complexity. You have some very complex biological systems, and if you take a part of them away, they cease to work. And this one is William Dembski. He's a philosopher, and he invented what he calls the design filter, which means that first of all you look as if something is due to natural selection, then can it be, if not, is it due to chance, and if not, then all that is left is intelligent design. So, why not teach creationism, including intelligent design, in science school classes? First, because it's not science. Secondly, to teach it as science would give students the wrong idea of what science is. In other words, it's just not fair on the students. And by all means, teach it in history of science classes as examples of models of the world that were formerly believed until they were shown to be incorrect, like geocentrism, four bodily humours, four elements, phlogiston, and of course creationism has no more scientific validity than any of those. Why not at least teach the scientific controversy, however? Because there is no controversy.
I think we're running a little late, but I felt it was better to actually let people have their say rather than playing bells out once I stop talking. We'll have a short period for questions. We're rounded out for an hour. I'll ask our 4 speakers to come down front. No, we're not going to ask you to sit falling on the chairs. Just come down here and we'll take questions from the audience for that next 10 minutes or so.
A person calls, what a scientist would call what a layperson calls a theory, actually a hypothesis, right? A scientist has a sort of an idea of what they think might be true. It's a hypothesis. You test it, test it, test it, and eventually it becomes what we would call a law, or excuse me, a theory. But when a person says a theory, they say, you know, I have a theory that, really what they're saying is I have a hypothesis that. So if you call it the theory of evolution, that makes it seem like it's just an idea. And it's not. It's really, you know, quite strong, just like gravitation or you know, the theory of optics or the theory of anything else. And so you can worm your way around this by saying it's just a theory. And that's just a weasel word. And so I think that them putting those stickers on there is misleading. It's using the wrong word. In a sense, it's fraudulent. Because they should be saying, you should be warned that the ideas about evolution here are just a law. Okay, and then what would you do?
I think you need to talk to the Pope. In October 1998, in October 1998, he said, the theory of evolution is more than a hypothesis.
And since then, ever since then, there has been arguing about the translation from French, what he actually meant. These, by the way, people who hate Catholics because they're fundamental Protestants.
My comment on that sticker is that it shows that whoever made the sticker has got no understanding of what science is. And what are they doing sticking stickers in science books if they don't understand what science is? Perhaps, you know, in the interests of equality, we should go around putting stickers in the Bible saying, look, it's only belief. Perhaps then they might understand, you know, particularly if you identified that you're coming from a science organisation, maybe the AAAS or something like that, just to sort of say, well, you know, what are you doing telling us what science is when you've got no idea?
Yes, Phil, don't criticise the lack of logic here, but the question would be...
That's a horrible way to start a question.
How can any number you like to think of, 50 million, 80 million, 90 million, Americans be wrong?
Very easy. Gee, what are the odds of that happening?
Every 4 years.
Just reword the answer.
I'm not talking about politics, I'm talking about religion. Or the same thing, isn't it?
I mean, you know, I was.
You can't establish
my
truth
flippant
by
answer would be-
democratic vote.
My flippant answer would be that luckily we don't have to vote on what truth is. Unfortunately, in my country, that's not necessarily true anymore. And if enough people say something's not true, then they can force their way into having it taught that way. And it's kind of funny because the American Constitution, which I've read many times, is basically a way of protecting the minority from the majority's point of view, and it's failing us right now. And I you know, hopefully groups like this can do something about it. Don't let it happen here. I may be moving here, by the way.
It's easy to make the mistake of thinking that because they accept stupid things that they're stupid people. The people in creationism, particularly those at the top, are actually very intelligent people, is my experience. The fact that you're intelligent doesn't mean that you can, therefore, everything in your life has to be logical and reasonable. There are people here who are otherwise good skeptics who think that people like Don Bradman are divinity. The link between someone being an intelligent person and them holding a belief that is otherwise irrational to other people, I can't understand how that happens, but it does, and it's not just the creationists who do this. The only thing that I can see as consistent in them is that their understanding of the world is based on their literal understanding of the Bible, and therefore everything flows from that. That is their logical construct. By itself, it is actually a logical construct. It's only when it's in conflict with other logical constructs, such as evolutionary theories, such as scientific theories, that contradict it, that then they come into the light of looking stupid.
You learn about the Bible. People are at their best and at their worst in religion, and sometimes those two things happen at exactly the same time. And I agree with Peter. It's quite often the fact that the more bizarre theories are the ones that are held by the most intelligent people within religion. But I think it is a mistake to try and find the explanation within religion itself, because this is pretty much a phenomenon of Western culture. And I think we've got to look beyond religion to what is happening within our society at large that promotes this sort of situation. I mean, I gave a couple of explanations, but there are more in my mind. I think what we're seeing in a way is a deep disease within Western culture about a whole set of fundamental issues, not the least of which is the sort of decline of the middle class and the sort of values that, in a sense, the middle class has always held the values of Western societies. And while the middle class was secure and in place, often the nature of debate had a type of sort of richness about it, but people are under threat. People are looking for certainties. There's enormous pressures are coming on. And I think people often retreat to these absolute positions as a way of giving them comfort in difficult times. And